Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Property and Investor Podcast. This is the podcast when I speak to some of the most interesting, inspiring, and resilient people in property investing and beyond. As you know, nothing in this podcast is financial, legal, or health advice. Nothing amounts to an endorsement or a recommendation. Do your own diligence. Health warning over. As you know, I'm your host, Paul Lanfear, and I am absolutely delighted to introduce you to our podcast guest today, Sean Knott. Sean, a very warm welcome to the podcast, my friend.
Good morning, Paul. How are you?
I am very well. And for those that watch who are listening, just to let you know, Sean and I clearly exchanged notes in preparation for the podcast. We look virtually identical today.
I thought that was just the standard request that you need to wear a black shirt.
I'd say it's like a brand, it's a podcast brand compliant approach you got there, Sean. I like it a lot.
You did send it to me. I received it just yesterday in the post. Thank you.
Oh, perfect. I should do it for all of my guests. So it's really Sean and I have known each other for years and years and years, and I'm obviously a Sean fan, as you'll discover. But obviously, in preparation for podcasts, I do a bit of research, and I've learned some things about Sean that I didn't know, which we'll get to in the podcast, hopefully. But let me give a bit of introduction to my guest for those that haven't heard of him. So Sean is an advertising and lifestyle professional photographer from South Africa, now lives in the UK, the north of England, shoots all over the world, does some really wild stuff. He's really worth following. We'll give the link for that. So he specializes in photographing stuff like lifestyle stuff. So sports, fashion, but you'll see him at, if you follow his stuff, you'll see him at some pretty glamorous locations as well. He says this in his LinkedIn profile, and it's actually true. And I'm not suggesting other people lie on their LinkedIn profile, but he describes himself as like truly collaborative. Having worked as a client of Sean's, I can tell you that is most definitely the experience. It's a really different experience. And he invests in property and does lots of other wild things. Sean, how are you doing, mate?
Fantastic. Thank you for the intro. I feel honored to be on this. I kind of, in terms of property, I don't feel I'm quite where I'd like to be, but I suppose everybody feels a bit like that. But I feel honored to be asked to be on the podcast. So thanks very much.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. And I suppose let's square that off straight away then. But that's how everybody feels, in my experience, about property, is they're not further enough ahead. They haven't done all the rest of it. My base case on that is if you're in the game and you're still in the game, you're winning. Okay, there's lots of people who are not still in the game who could still be in the game and aren't.
Yeah, and I'm starting to see that the more I'm in the game, the more I'm starting to see that it's like any other field, really. So yeah, it's quite exciting though. All good.
And look, in terms of we'll get to it in due course, but in terms of the work that you have done, I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. I suppose as we'd anticipate for somebody, like you as a photographer, I mean, the design of your stuff is absolutely breathtaking. Maybe we can signpost people into where they can look at that if that's available. But let's get on with the business in hand. Oh. So, Sean, I have the pleasure of knowing you very well. We've known each other for years, done lots of exciting stuff together. We've even climbed a mountain together and all that business. We'll get to that as well in due course. But you've got a really fascinating origin story. So, as is traditional for this version of the podcast, I'm going to be quiet now. I'm going to hand over to you. Tell us the Sean origin story, please.
Right, the origin story. It's funny, when I was coming onto this, I've been trying to rack my brains and go back in time. I'm obviously from South Africa originally. I was born in Port Elizabeth, which is on the East Coast for those people who don't know. Lived there for a few years, probably 2 or 3 years, and then my family moved up to Johannesburg. I later on discovered that the reason why we moved up to Johannesburg was that I was adopted at a very young age, sort of weeks rather than anything longer than that. And I think my parents obviously decided they wanted to change the part of the country that they were living in, so moved up to Johannesburg. And yeah, I grew up in Johannesburg most of my life, had a really lovely upbringing, was really fortunate in that way. My mother and father were both sporty. My father worked for Legal in General, as he was quite senior in Legal in General in South Africa, and my mother was a secretary, sort of assistant type thing. And they were both very sporty, so I kind of got introduced to sport from a really young age. I played a lot of sport. I played all the normal things you have to do as a South African. Played cricket, rugby, football. I played baseball a lot as well, to quite a high level. And yeah, so when I was 6 years old, my mother and father got divorced, and basically my mother brought me up as a single mother. Had an older brother who was a half brother, which I believed was a half brother at the time. And he was about 10 or 11 years older than me. So we were never really that close because he was off doing his own thing. And yeah, I had lots of friends. So I think as effectively an only child, I just had a lot of mates, and obviously through school and through sport. So it, yeah, my life was just consumed by sport, really. And I was trying to think back on when my working life began, and a friend of mine came over a couple of weeks ago. We went down to watch. I'm a big Tottenham Hotspurs supporter, and so is he. And he comes over from South Africa every kind of couple of years or so. And he reminded me that his father, who was our football coach when we were sort of 7, 8 years old, also managed to give us a job delivering newspapers when we were in primary school. So we'd go out really early in the morning, as you do, delivering newspapers, which I completely forgot about. But obviously it was my first introduction to work of some sort. And then when I went to high school, I was actually, when I was at primary school, I was deputy head boy, so really bright kid and that. And then I discovered high school and girls and life. and things changed quite a bit then, you know. But yeah, I had still played a lot of sport, but also started working. So I remember I worked in supermarkets, I worked in big sort of department stores and that. So I was working from a very young age, trying to earn my own money. So I was trying to work out where that independence came from, and it was obviously from that. Yeah, so went through my high school years, went through a little spell of being a bit of a tearaway, which I put my mother through, my adopted mother. I put her through a hell of a lot. So I figured I owed it to her to stand by her when she actually told me that I'd been adopted. And I was so busy doing my own thing at that stage that it didn't really affect me. And looking back on it, I'm so grateful, because once people find out they're adopted, it becomes consuming, and it becomes their entire life is trying to find their biological parents, which, because I'd obviously come from such a loving family, I didn't really have this big urge to go and do that. So I just carried on with life as normal.
So pausing for breath there, like, how old were you when you found out that you were adopted?
Well, it's funny though, because my mother obviously didn't know how to deal with the situation. So she sort of blurted it out when I was 16 years old at a family get together. I think it was my cousin's wedding, and she just obviously didn't know when the right time was. And she thought that it was brought about in conversation, and she just blurted it out. And it's funny though, because we looked to adopt as well after we had our daughter, and they kept on saying, you need to let kids know from a very young age that they're from a different family. And I was going, well, that doesn't seem right to me. Surely they want to be part of the family. And I was only told when I was 16 years old. So I thought, I'm proof that maybe that's not such a good idea to tell them when they're too young. But anyhow, I was so into what I was doing in life, and so focused on friends and what I was doing, that I just it didn't really affect me majorly at all. Well, at all, really. And then we just carried on as normal. I think I maybe threw it back in my mother's face once ever after that. And yeah, we sort of, I just carried on as normal. It's funny though, because my mother was about 5 foot tall, and my brother, who was my adopted brother, was 5'5", and
Okay.
I'm 6'3".
So there may have been a clue somewhere.
Yeah, and maybe I was just blocking it out. I don't know. I don't know
Yeah.
what the deal was, but it was it just didn't really affect me. And
What's fascinating from there, like listening to you, it's obvious that all of your needs were being met, weren't they? You were obviously happy and having all of the aspects of life being fulfilled, and you didn't have this kind of, it didn't set you off on a quest, to find a missing link or anything at that stage.
exactly, and that was the thing that I was most grateful for. And I mean, obviously things changed as we got to later on in my life, which we can come to, but it's it's the thing I'm most grateful for. My wife's a psychologist, and she loves watching these long lost family programs, and I don't enjoy watching them, but so many times I've caught some of them, and these people might be 60, 70 years old, and they're still on this massive quest of trying to find a bit more out about their birth parents. So I was just grateful it didn't come to that. And it was obviously, as you say, all my needs were being met. I was loved. And yeah, it was still good, even though my mother and father were divorced. My father, I mean, I used to see him on a fairly regular basis, maybe 2 or 3 times a year, which I guess isn't regular at all compared to what some kids have. But was still in contact, and it seemed to work, And my brother, who was 10, 11 years older than me, he went to the army. So when I was sort of 6, 7 years old, he was in the army at the time. So my mother, it was just basically the two of us, and she was working, bless her. So coming from South Africa, a lot of us used to have maids. So if it wasn't for Black African ladies, a lot of white South African kids wouldn't have been brought up the way they were, and she was effectively a second mother to me, and my mother could go off and work and provide while we had the maid who was looking after me, and if I was being naughty, dealing with me.
And what was her name?
The name was Elizabeth Skeberesh. Yeah, so she was very close, and it's funny though, because a lot of people get a bit confused sometimes when they think South Africa, you have a maid, they immediately think servants, and it was nothing like that. It used to be when I was really young, she'd bath and feed me until my mother came home. And as I got older, if I was naughty, she'd give me a slap because, and if my mother came home and told me Elizabeth had given me a smack, it was because I deserved it. It wasn't because of anything other than that, So, yeah, had a really good upbringing, and like I said, I had lots of close friends. So always had friends that I was out with. As I got to high school, I got a bit more serious into my rugby. So played rugby until obviously I finished school. And then after school, what everybody was doing, well, my group, people were going to the army because we had national service at the time. So it was like the next progression was just to go to the army, which was a 2-year national service, of which it was cut down when I was in there in my second year. So the first year in the army in South Africa, it's not quite like the British Army, which is a proper job in South Africa, being national service. It was hard graft for not very much money. So in my infinite wisdom, I thought, well, instead of just doing my basic training, what I'll do is I'll carry on and do what they call the junior leaders course, so you could get rank. You'd either become a corporal or you'd become a lieutenant. And those people who had studied and went into the army, they normally became a 2-star lieutenant. And as a school leaver, you could only become a 1-star lieutenant. So I thought, I want to become a lieutenant, and did this. So basically, they, instead of being beasted for your basic training, you got beasted for almost a year, and then for the next year, it was supposed to be a vacush year. You got paid double the amount of money you were getting. So it was an interesting time as well, But but something I'd do again if I got the opportunity, because I learned a lot, discipline, how far I can be pushed, you know, that type of thing. So it was, yeah, it was all good. Where are we now on this life story thing?
If we hover over the national service, because you know, I remember you mentioning that to me the first time, and I suppose what I was surprised at, which maybe I shouldn't have been, is how much you enjoyed it and how much you got out of it, and actually how much fun you had during it. And I've reflected, like, ever since, about I suspect it'll be a reasonably unpopular measure in most places in the UK to introduce national service. But if we, like, ignore that just for the time being, there could be an avenue, couldn't they, where national service could be a really thrilling thing for young people to do. So, you know, because everybody's so different, aren't they? So there's obviously people who like fancy the idea of being in, like, the infantry and doing, like, you know, the blood and gut stuff. But then there's the engineers. Then there's, you know, like, in this day and age, there's all the people in cyber intelligence and all the rest of it. One would hope you could, and maybe this is wishful and optimistic thinking on my part, if we did have a form of national service, you could guide people into an area where they maybe would be able to thrive. You know, like, I know people who would, if you gave them a tractor, they would love to drive a tractor, you know. Whereas I know people, if you gave them a laptop and said, you know, we want you to ethically hack this, they'd have a great time. Not everybody wants to kind of be in the infantry, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, fortunately, I wasn't in the infantry. I ended up, when we had finished our training, I actually worked with what I call, they were the proper soldiers, so the reconnaissance commandos in the South African Defence Force were a bit like the SAS and those types, you know. So you used to deal with all these really interesting things that would go on. But I was office based in my second year, but would meet some real characters, you know. So it was really interesting in that way. Yeah, and I think that if there was national service, I think it can do wonders for youngsters coming through, you know. Absolutely. I'd highly recommend it.
Now, I want you to get into the next part of the story, but something is playing on my mind, which and I'm not a football fan, so I have no horse in this race and no allegiance here. Tottenham Hotspurs. So how does somebody from Johannesburg become a Tottenham fan?
Well, I'm glad you asked.
I'm not sure I am, but
no. The only reason being was when I was a child, every single South African kid that I knew supported Manchester United or Liverpool. And at the time, Tottenham Hotspur, I quite liked the white kit that they had, and there were people like Glenn Hoddle and Ozzy Ardiles and Steve Archibald. So it was just some of the players at the time, and I wanted to be a bit different from my friends, and I've got stuck with that for the last 40 odd years.
Well, look, I can see that it gives you pleasure, so clearly it was the right decision, wasn't it? So you've done national service. What happens then?
So after national service, the next part of the progression was getting a job. It's funny because I was looking back at how things were, and I remember my mother saying to me, and I think I might have even been paying rent before I went to the army, because I was working. So when I was still at school, but definitely when I'd finished the army and came back and started working, my mother was asking for rent, which I couldn't imagine asking my daughter for rent when she's living in our house. I don't know. Kids today probably don't have that pushed upon them. I don't know. It depends. I suppose it depends until what age they staying at home for until. But the next thing was to find work, and a lot of people that I knew that were years ahead of me at school seemed to be getting jobs as sales reps, and it's funny though, because a natural progression, is for people to naturally want to go to university 90% of the time. In South Africa, in our cohort, there was none of that. So people were becoming sales reps, and my brother had worked in the industrial sort of area, probably dealing mainly specializing in bearings and lifting equipment. So he used to work with the mines a lot. So he managed to, through the company he was working for, get me a job as a sales rep. And I was like, brilliant, here we go. And actually quite enjoyed the job. I got a company car and I drove it. And this is only 20 years old. So probably younger, 19 years old. And I started sales repping, and I just thought it's not really my thing, but I kind of just got on with it, and obviously started saving money. And then my best mate, well, one of my best mates, who lives in Australia, in Sydney now, him and I decided that we were going to go traveling, because a lot of the years ahead of us at the time, everybody was doing the year-long traveling thing. So we thought, right. And I was working with a guy who must have been in his mid to late 60s, who was a fantastic human being, but his life had just been a sales rep for all that time. And I just thought, that's not really what I want to be doing. You know, I didn't know what I wanted to be doing. I didn't have a clue, if I'm honest. And my mate and I decided we were going to go traveling for a year, because that's what everybody was doing. So we saved up, and everybody said, oh, they'll be back in 6 months. Some said 3 months. The really decent ones gave us a year, and that was in 1992. And then I discovered that the world was a big place. Traveled aimlessly. Well, I used to say aimlessly. It was never aimlessly, because just from the experience is how I got to where I am today. You know, so it's it was just an incredible experience coming from this. And it wasn't like a little tiny town where I came from in Johannesburg. It was a big town, not a city, but it wasn't far from Johannesburg. Central was maybe less than 10 miles away, or 10 miles away, say. But I just only knew one way of living. You know, I didn't really know much about apartheid and what had gone on, because our little environment that we lived in, people weren't racist. Those things were going on at the time, but I wasn't directly experiencing any of that. I knew it was going on, but where we lived, black and white people, our maids, like I said, everything was just just fairly normal, you know, and really discovered more about that. And I'm not saying it wasn't going on at all, because I discovered more when I left South Africa. So it shows people weren't being told a lot, you know. But anyhow, flew to London. My mother said, my boy, when you get, I'm not going to really be able to support you. So kind of, she effectively told me I was on my own, and that was how it was. So I arrived in London with my best mate and £800, and blew that money in about 6 weeks. And just started trying to make my way from there. You know, started working in pubs and basically whatever sort of temporary work I could get my hands on, and just traveled for a while. I was in London on and off for 3 years, then and then I'd get money together, and then we'd travel to Europe, and then I was in America, went to America for 3 years. So I chop and change between London and the States, and just discovered how interesting the world was. You know, it was just a real eye opener coming from this town in Johannesburg. And obviously it was before the internet, so you never had anything available to you other than going into libraries and reading books, and constantly reverse charges to South Africa, making my mother pay for the phone calls. So just kind of probably for, must have been 6 years, was in Australia for a year, traveled through Central America and parts of Southeast Asia, and did all sorts, did construction work, did bar work, did drug trials to earn money to travel.
I thought you were going to say did drug trafficking. I'm glad the word trials emerged in that sentence.
No, we didn't try trafficking. But yeah, and spent just having a good time, you know, not really knowing where I was going with my life, to tell you the truth. It was a bit of a, what I always thought was going to be a bit of a fact-finding mission. And then obviously had cameras and well, a very basic camera, and sort of just took photos of travel. So I wasn't really into my photography then. And we were living in New York, and we were doing sort of working on a motor yacht that went around Manhattan. So we were doing these dinner cruises. So we were there for about 4 or 5 months, and we'd go to the bookshops and read in Barnes and Nobles and that. I'd go sit in there, and I just kind of came across photography, and I started reading about it, and I liked the technical side of it. And I was just, for once in my life, everything I read was just staying in my head, and I was just found it really sort of captivated, you know. And then we went from America to Australia, and my wife was my girlfriend at the time, Caroline, my wife, bought me this little 35mm Canon camera, and I was besotted with it, you know. Wherever I went, I was taking some of the worst photographs ever, but I started taking pictures, and I was like, this is amazing, and reading books, and it just kind of went from there, the photography element, you know. And then Caroline's father passed away towards the end of 1996 when we were in Australia, and we decided we were going to come back, and we were going to try and immigrate to Australia. And Caroline was going to go back into the industry she had been working in, and I was going to study photography, so then we could get back to Australia to immigrate. So we came back to the UK, bought a little house in Knaresborough. I was driving around trying to find somewhere for us to live, while Caroline was working in Leeds, and I had Caroline's company car driving around where I thought we could find a place to live. Drove into Knaresborough, and I was like, this is it, you know, we're moving to Knaresborough. And yeah, that's kind of where that ended.
And do you live, obviously, let's not invade your privacy, but just in general terms, do you live in the same house, or have you moved around that location?
No, we moved into a little house just before the housing crash in 2007, 2008, and we sold a property there. We did it up. We were on the bones of our house, really. We had nothing. And we did a house up, and we're able to jump up a bit up the ladder. So we've only really been in 2 houses since we got back from Australia, and this one that we're in needed a hell of a lot of work, and we've sort of we've kind of almost got there with it, you know. So that's how we did the property thing. Yeah. So
when did you originally meet Caroline?
I met her in London. When I was living in London, I lived with about another 10, 12 South Africans down in Wimbledon. And Caroline used to own a bar in Ios in Greece, and she came back. She had met some South Africans out there who I was sharing a house with, and she arrived in, it was 1994, because I remember the World Cup was on, and she arrived, and I met her really briefly. She fancied a friend of mine, which I keep reminding her about. And yes, so we basically got it together.
Just to stop you there, Sean, that was a long time ago, mate. You need to let that go, you know.
Yeah, I have, Paul. I have. And anyhow, yeah. So the same group of friends, or the group of friends that went to Australia, we went to Fort Lauderdale because we had work lined up there, and I'd been working there previously. So Caroline came, and then we sort of got it together then, and I went off to Central America. She drove across the States, and we met back up on the West Coast. And then we went and made our way across to New York, where we worked on this motor yacht doing these sort of dinner charters. And yeah, we were in New York before going across to LA, and then onto Australia, where we spent a year.
My impression is that Caroline has kind of had a really profound impact on you and your life. I mean, it seems like you have this pretty remarkable thing going on.
More so than you'd believe, Paul, because as I said earlier, Caroline, she's a psychologist, and she's always had this natural way of counseling all of our friends throughout our travels and wherever we've been. And it was her gentle persuasion, shall we say, to try and find my biological mother. I don't know, is it time to come on to that? Have I covered?
Well, let's come on to that in a second. I just want to square off one thing, which is that obviously you took up the photography, you've moved to you've come to your senses and you moved to Yorkshire, obviously God's own county. You find yourself at the University of Huddersfield, so just explain that in a sentence then.
Well, actually, when we came to Yorkshire, I managed to get onto a course studying a national diploma in photography in Leeds, and from after that 2-year course, I didn't feel I was quite ready to get out there and start being a photographer. So I got the opportunity to go and do a degree at Huddersfield University. We were based at Batley College, but it was Huddersfield University, and and I believe that's where you studied, which is what.
So in my due diligence of kind of just doing a bit of research, I discovered that you'd went to, not only did you go to the University of Huddersfield, but you went within a couple of years of me, but you also got a first in photography. I mean, that's extraordinary.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's probably the first time this has come up in years. I mean, being a photographer, what I've discovered, having done it now for so long, is that it's about the work you produce, so I've never gone into an agency and have people said to me, what did you get for your degree? Which I would have loved to have gone. I got a first degree, but it's just not that industry, it's about the work you can produce, is what it boils down to. But I'm glad to say that getting back to the South African part, when I left the army, started working, never in my wildest dreams did I ever think that I was going to study, full stop, never mind study and get a degree in photography, so.
So I didn't know that we had that shared history of going to Huddersfield, and we both got firsts. And I'd say the same thing about getting a first. Is once you've done the job interview and they've given you the job, no one seems to care anymore. So, and it's like all of that work, and nobody ever asked. Anyway, so let's transition. So then you go through your photography career, and at some point you take an interest in property. So let's just cover off the property angle before we get to, I think, the main event in a way. So what got your interest in property? Because you're one of these people who, I remember one of our first conversations was around the fact that, I love my job. I love my job, and I could see in your eyes that you absolutely loved your job. And I was like, Sean, if you love your job, it puts you in like the 1% of the population who really love their job. For the love of God, do not let anybody persuade you to sack your boss, And
you know what, Paul, I'll never forget one of the first times, in fact, it might have been the first time I met you. It was, there was some function, it might have been it was definitely a property thing in Leeds. And I think I came with Alex, and I remember, and I'd been doing courses as I thought I needed to be doing, and there were people saying, it's best to burn the bridges, and I was like, hey, but I absolutely love my day job. I don't want to. And I was really getting into photography, and I can't remember, it was probably just before COVID, and then I met you, and you just said there's something about having a job, for starters, a day job, rather than just throwing yourself into it, but especially something that you enjoy so much. So I'll never forget that, because it made me think, well, what I'm doing with my property journey is running it alongside my photography. It took me, because I obviously studied photography as a mature student, I discovered this thing after traveling around, and I thought, this is it. This is what I've been looking for. So I put photography on such a pedestal that when I finished studying, I thought, what happens if it doesn't happen for me? And I was so scared that it wasn't going to happen. And then the more I threw myself into it, the more it was like, it's like anything I do. You've just got to graft like anything, and it'll happen, And and obviously I've loved pretty much, I won't say I've loved every day, because there's been some jobs which have been absolute nightmares over the years, but every day for me is just taking pictures on a scale of things, what you could be doing. I could be a sales rep selling bearings to the mine still, but property, I sort of I was always quite interested in it, thinking about a pension, really, because I thought I'd seen it, and I tried to convince Caroline probably about 2006, 2007. Oh, we should really get into this property thing. And she was like, I'm not sure. And then the whole market crashed. And I was glad that I listened to her. But coming around, so I was always interested in it, and I just wasn't sure what I wanted to do. And then I discovered there were courses you could do, and I started doing the odd course, and I was really conscious not to get caught up in, I saw people that were almost becoming these serial property course types, and I sort of, I did the basic training because I knew not very much at all, so everything was going to be fairly new to me. And then HMOs sort of jumped out for me, because I thought it's all new to me. I know people say start with single buy-to-lets and move on to it, but I thought I don't know much about any of it, so I might as well just do the one which is going to give me better returns. So I got quite into it, doing various, as when I first met you, and then obviously during COVID, my work became non-existent. I photograph people for a living, and it just stopped altogether. So we got the fright of our lives, because it was obviously a big chunk of income to lose from our household. And fortunately, Caroline has a proper job, as I always say. She works for the NHS, and she worked throughout. And I decided that I was going to try and get this property on the go. So I think it must have been probably just before COVID that, or was it? It was just before everything came to a complete standstill. So it was maybe after the worst of COVID, and did the first HMO in Leeds, which I panicked about as well, because I was thinking I want to come in from a design background, and I got a really good interior designer and stylist who I'd been working with, Kate, who helped me out massively. And we were going to do it the way we ended up doing the one in Leeds. And halfway through it, I was thinking, should we do something just cheap and cheerful? Because are people going to want to live in HMOs? There was that period where people were going, who wants to live in shared accommodation, where it turned out to be completely the opposite, need to have somebody to live with. And so just stuck with it. It was really tough, because obviously I was sort of relying on my day job helping me fund any extras on the property, and there was no day job. So I did a lot of laboring and helping out, which I wanted to get the sort of full experience of the property process. Then kind of got it up and running, and touch wood, I haven't had a void since I've set it up. So yeah, that's effectively how I got into the whole property thing. Obviously, coming to Leeds property breakfast was, I wouldn't say it was one of the first meetings I attended, but it's the one that I've stuck with, because it's the most enjoyable for me, and I have a connection with most of the people there,
So look, there's some real nuggets out there which we're going to draw out. So I mean, I think there's like a few like real gems in there that are just worth re-articulating, just so that they land. Which is, so often there is a couple, and there is an interest in property. What was really interesting about the way that you guys approached it is that it wasn't like, well, one, you both didn't ditch the day job, which for I would say most people, that's pretty wise, is not to ditch the day jobs, unless you've got an enormous appetite for risk and you have very low overheads and very few responsibilities. But that, is very few people. What also I think really worked is the fact that you know, your life partner didn't jump ship and kind of become a property person as well, because it's really hard when people do that. And when couples come and ask me and they say, oh, you know, do you think we should be in the property business together? My answer is always the same, which is absolutely not, you know, unless you have to, and it's you know, you can't resist doing it. It adds, you know, me and my wife Liz, obviously we've worked at it for years, and you know, we've perhaps put a lot of work just into the working together thing. I think if you can have somebody, if you can have like your other part of your life which isn't in the property camp, you know, it just makes everything a little bit
And
easier.
and with Caroline, she was quite wary because of the 2007 2008 thing, and she's lived through ridiculous interest rates in the UK, so she's always been probably the stabilizer for us. And I guess the property, the first one, I needed to prove to her that it can work, which I've done. So her outlook has changed enormously, but she still prefers to keep separate. She'll stand by me through thick and thin on it, but it's not really her thing.
And I
She,
think there's huge value in that. Like I would, you know, I definitely wouldn't tinker with that. And clearly a wise woman. So let's move on then. So then obviously, and it's a fantastic project, and anybody who seeks out Sean's work will see, you know, it's absolutely breathtaking. I mean, it's like grade A, triple star, one of the most beautiful things you'll ever see. But then COVID came, and COVID obviously it was kind of life-changing in your family in a way. Do you want to talk through what happened there?
it was enormously life-changing, really, because as I said to you on and off, I mean, Caroline suggested many years ago, in fact, it wasn't many years ago, it was when Megan, our daughter, was born. I became conscious of not having that sort of family history. And for the first time ever, I thought maybe we should look into biological parents, just so we can get an idea of, it was more from a health point of view, I think, for me. And Caroline, like I said, every now and again, just gently pop the seed. Why don't we try this? Why don't we try that? And we had been looking, I'd emailed the South African adoption services, and it's probably quite difficult to get that sorted out in the UK. Go to South Africa and try get something sorted out like that. It's years, and it's really trying to pull teeth. But we tried it on and off over the years, and probably not long before COVID, we had tried again. I tried a few different avenues, and came up with nothing. And then one day, out of the blue, we got an email through with my birth certificate, my original birth certificate, which my mother in South Africa was quite old school, and she didn't really want to give too much away on that. And so for the first time ever, we had discovered who my birth mother was. And we had sort of a trail of inquiry, if you like. So we it's funny because Caroline's not really a social media type person, but between her and my daughter, within 2 weeks through Facebook, we had almost put a picture together of who we thought was my birth mother, and possible siblings, you know, and through the power of Facebook. And it was quite scary, because I'd go out for a bike ride, and every time I'd come back, and Caroline and Megan, my daughter, would be sitting in the living room saying they've been online and they'd found another bit of information. And I was almost too scared to go cycling, because I knew they'd start doing their sort of inspector work, you know. And kind of quite a very long story short, we found who we thought was my mother, who was originally from Zimbabwe, and went down to Port Elizabeth in South Africa to obviously have me, and had to give me up for adoption, because in that generation, I feel like I need to say this, but that generation was obviously very strict and very sort of conservative. in Zimbabwe at the time, and her father was quite a senior guy, like a district officer type person. So she was sort of sent off to South Africa, and that's why she had to give me up for adoption. But that story could carry on forever, so I'll just try and sort of summarize the whole thing. And got in touch with a guy who we thought looked remarkably like me, and who was living in Australia at the time, and got in touch with him, and through some to-ing and fro, and he said, what you're effectively saying is that that I'm your brother, and my mother's your mother. And I was like, yeah, that's kind of what we're saying. Showed the proof, and this sort of, and then never really heard anything for a while, and then Caroline, I came back from a bike ride one day, and
it all happens when you're on a bike ride, John.
Yeah, that's why I'm scared to go out on my bike. And I got back, and Caroline and Megan had composed had drawn up this letter, and it was just to say, send this letter to this lady who we thought was my mother, who was turns out was based down in Devon. Sorry, in Dorset, not in Devon, in Dorset. So Caroline, through some of her investigative work again, we sent a letter to this lady who we effectively knew was my mother, and she got back and said, you know, she apologized, obviously, because she thought that it'd been 50 years at this stage, you know, and obviously it was so overwhelming for her, and she hadn't told anybody in all that time, which was the best part of the whole story for me, is that this burden is now off of her shoulders that she's had to deal with for all this time. And replied to the letter and said she wanted to meet up with us. Cut a very long story short, since then we've been meeting up with them, we've been holidaying, they've been staying up with us, and this is turns out I've got a brother, two brothers and a sister, of which I've got a brother who's living in the UK, sister who's living in the UK, and a brother who's living in South Africa still, and family that they have. So I've gone from this effectively and sorry to tell you some other news while this was all happening. It was just absolutely insane. This period was, my mother in South Africa passed away from COVID.
Oh God.
And this was all happening at the same time, which was just incredible. And then my brother, who suffered from diabetes, after my mother passed away, he had spent all of his life with her. And probably my mother passed away in the July in 2021, and my brother passed away in the December. He had a stroke. That's another whole story in its own right, but this was all happening at the same time, you know, so it was a really crazy time. I felt guilty for a long time because of this, but I've managed to get over that. And I have a family that we're in touch with on a regular basis. We're going down to see my sister to birthday next weekend, and my mother's coming up there. And I also have to mention her husband, who has been incredible through this whole process, because he's been as accepting of me as he is of his own children. So a remarkable human being. But the best story about this is Caroline and Megan obviously are over the moon with it. I'm over the moon with it. But the best bit is that this lady, my mother, has got this off of her chest, that she carried with her for 50 years. And she is the nicest person you could ever come across, you know. And I look like her, you know, which was so weird, because I have a distinct look. I get that. And for a long time, we couldn't work out where it might have come from. And it comes from originally from Cornwall in the UK, you know. I mean, obviously, I'm South African born and bred, but it turns out that the family came from Cornwall originally, you know. So So I've learned so much in over this period, but the best part of the story is that this a really amazing lady has got this thing that she's carried for all of her life off of her chest, really, you know. So
I mean, that is just unbelievably remarkable. I mean, we should say, obviously, my heart goes out to you if you lost of your mum in South Africa and your brother, especially in such close proximity. And then there's this extraordinary unraveling of the rest of it, and to meet your biological mum, for her to have this kind of, I don't know if the word redemption is the right word, but to have this lifting off her shoulders of everything that she's experienced. I mean, it's just truly remarkable, isn't it?
it's incredible, you know, and you couldn't write the outcome. You couldn't write a better story. It couldn't be better on one of these programs that Caroline watches all the time. And it's thanks to Caroline. It's thanks to her gently nudging me over the years. And yeah, it's been incredible. I mean, who would have thought at the age of 50 you discover your biological family, you know? So
I'll tell you what, it's pretty extraordinary.
I'm a really lucky guy, you know.
Okay, so that's the origin story, which is just unbelievable. Let's quickly transition into some of the quick fire stuff then, as we begin to kind of bring this to conclusion. So Sean, give us a life lesson. So tell us about an event, can be good or bad, and in particular what the lesson was from it. So I always say when asking this question, obviously the facts of the story are of interest, and stories are how we learn, but for the just purposes of this podcast, what specifically was the lesson that you took away from it?
I think for me, I've learned so many different lessons in life, but I think for me, what started it all off was deciding to go traveling for a year. Is all I decided to do. Go traveling for a year. I was always going to go back to South Africa and make a career of some sort out there. And it was just making that decision to go, because the lessons that I've learned from that, it's opened my eyes to the world, to different cultures, to different to photography. I mean, when I left South Africa, I didn't even know you could make a living out of photography. I didn't even know it existed, you know, never mind make a decent living out of it. So yeah, it was just taking that plunge, and that lesson is, yeah, it's vast. Yeah, has that answered that?
It is. I think that's a fabulous answer. I mean, traveling is one of those things that, I mean, you get to see other cultures, and often other cultures which are sometimes kind of strategically positioned against us, as if these people are enemies. And then you go to that place and you realize that actually they look very similar to us, and their interests are pretty similar. Like, most people care about their kids and want their kids to thrive.
There's so many life lessons you can get from how different nationalities or cultures approach life, and you can take good and bad and know how to improve, as an individual, I think. So yeah, definitely.
I think as well, particularly for like maybe young people now, in terms of thinking about traveling, one of the things that you alluded to, which I thought was really fascinating, was that when you were out of South Africa, you learned about South Africa. I've certainly have that, like traveling to other countries and people talking about the UK. And within the UK, there's a little bit of a movement, not a little bit, but there is a movement to talk very negatively about the UK in the UK. But when you travel to other countries and you kind of mention that to people in passing, they kind of put their drink down and say, Paul, are you absolutely insane? You've got the rule of law, you've got property rights, you're a pretty safe country. You can walk down the street at night, you can go to church, you can express all kinds of different views, and you're more or less safe. You should try doing that when the country that I come from, and it's eye-opening.
Well, exactly. And I have regular contact with South Africa, so I know how things operate there on a day-to-day basis, and sometimes it can be, well, a lot of the time it's really frustrating, and now and again you can benefit from it because it's Africa, and and there's ways you can bypass certain parts of the process. Whereas, and I that only springs to mind because I've been going through a lot of legal stuff recently, in terms of the property business, which I'll get to, and things. Yeah, there's a process, and you'll get, if you need to get to D, if you start at A, you'll go through the process and you'll eventually get to D. Sometimes you just have to be super patient. In South Africa, you can sometimes bypass B and C, and you can just, there's a way to get to D, and cowboy country.
So it can work for you sometimes. Direction of travel, where do we go next? What's happening to you? Like, where are you heading?
So direction of travel, I've got another property which I should, within the next week or so, get a completion date. There's been a lot of sort of to-ing and fro-ing on this one, because I've got some investment coming from South Africa. So that's why I've been dealing with a lot of it recently. All the anti-money laundering and all the normal stuff, So we're kind of at the tail end of it now, and spoke to the solicitor yesterday, and it looks like we could be completing in the next, hopefully, couple of weeks. So really bad timing again, just before Christmas, but that's when I got the last one. The last one I started the project on about the 1st, 2nd of December. So this is sort of heading in the same direction, but excited to have another project on the go, because it's been a while, but I've just been concentrating on my photography, obviously coming out of COVID. And I want to sort of pick that up. That's the day job which pays for the houses effectively, So I want to concentrate on that going into the new year, and just push with on both fronts. I never thought the property thing I enjoy almost as much as the photography thing, which I never thought I'd find something else that gave me that enjoyment, although it can be super stressful. But as a very seasoned investor, but I'm going to just concentrate on those, keep my family happy. My daughter's studying medicine at university, make sure she's happy, and that's the plan.
And when you're not doing all of this, you also have a few lambs in your on your land, don't you? So you take care of a few lambs, and occasionally some of us get to benefit from that activity.
We share some land with neighbors behind our property, and it kind of stretches up to behind where they are. And we decided in 2014 we were going to put some sheep on there, just to keep the grass down and just maintain the land, and just to keep it turning over. We have lambing season every year, and we'll send lamb off for meat, which you've been kind enough to allow me to approach everybody from the property group. And I've got a lot of new customers who have given rave reviews on the lamb that we produce. So that's just a very side thing.
And I'm about to go and see my mum, and I'm going to take some of your produce to her, and she'll be very pleased indeed, I can tell you that. Health is wealth. Tell us something about your regime. So anywhere between 1 and 3 things that you think really contributes towards Sean's well-being.
To me personally, I don't have a morning routine that I do. I go out walking the dog every single morning on the field, but I try and get into the gym 3 or 4 times a week, and I try and do in the winter, coming into winter now, I'll try and do a ride on the week and 2 or 3 spin classes a week. So I need to do that just to kind of de-stress, and always have to do some kind of activity. We also go walking a lot when we get the chance. So always try and keep as active as I can, and chasing sheep, of course.
Obviously chasing sheep.
Which everybody does that, right?
So in a second, I'm going to ask you where we should send these good people so they can connect with your work, both, property wise, but also, you've discussed so much in this podcast that will resonate with people, but also maybe your photography stuff as well. But before we do, you're a regular attendee of the breakfast, and you've done the whole in Zoom thing over COVID, and you've done the in-person stuff. You've been on the inner circle. In fact, you came on the retreat. What are your kind of thoughts, observations about that? What would you say to anybody thinking about exploring those things?
As I said to you before, you kind of, out of doing meetings, and then I sort of came to yours, and I've sort of latched onto that, because it's always I think you've got this real knack of attracting the right people, whether it be the Leeds property meeting or the inner circle, which I did, but mainly I got a lot of enjoyment out of was the retreat that we did in the summer, which was incredible. You know, it always comes back to this with you about what you say, leave your egos at the door. And I know people have said that before, but it's just people that don't come with egos at all. And what I found most enjoyable about it is property is a part of it, but it's not all of it. It's just about people connecting on various different levels. It was almost a little bit spiritual. It's just good, wholesome fun, you know. And yeah, I'd if you get an opportunity, get in there for sure. I'll definitely be doing the retreat again next year. It was brilliant, and my paddleboarding's improved, which is great.
Well, your paddleboarding was pretty wild. I mean, you guys were making the human pyramid. Hopefully the insurance companies cover human pyramids on paddleboard. Well, look, it's really obviously a pleasure for me to hear things like that. And one of the things that I've said to you, and I would repeat, is that you really brought, as you do in everything that you do, a really fantastic energy to the event. But you know, like, everybody knows about Sean and his positive, good vibes. Like, when you walk into a room, everybody feels a bit more relaxed, a bit more content. So, as grateful as I am for your kind words, I would say, you know, you brought the magic to the retreat, and hence why I think, you know, we all had such a fantastic time. You also brought a poncho, which is now.
You've had a fire if it wasn't for the.
Exactly. If that poncho hadn't got that fire lit, I would have been in all kinds of trouble.
That's okay. It's really kind. Thanks for those words, Paul. It was great. And, you know, I always believe that happy people make happy people, you know. So, yeah, it rubs off, I think.
Amen to that. Okay, Sean, where shall we send these good people if they want to connect with you? So what social media links would you want in the show notes?
You can, on Instagram, you should find it if you put Sean Knott in, and it's Knott. But it's Shaunaboy, and Shaunaboy comes from what my maid used to call me in South Africa. She used to always go, Shaunaboy, she's not home. So it's my handle on Instagram is Shaunaboy, but I'm on LinkedIn. My website is just seanknott.com, SEANKNOTT.com. And yeah, you can get in touch with me. I'm on Facebook as well. So yeah.
Perfect. So I will put all of that stuff in the show notes that people can just click through and find you. So all that remains, Sean, is for me to heartfelt thanks for coming on the Property Investor Podcast. It's always a pleasure. I've really, you've got an amazing story that I'm sure people will find absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. I enjoyed it. Thanks a lot. Cheers.
So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That's the last Property and Investor podcast. To please like, follow, share the podcast. It makes a huge difference if you subscribe to the podcast. And please join it to discuss anything in this podcast. Join us at the next Property Investor Breakfast. There'll be a link below. The next one is the Discovery Day in January, where we'll work on our direction of travel, our vision, our goals, and all that kind of thing. And you might even get a prediction or two out of me. Thanks very much for listening. Keep well and speak soon.